Are you serious right now? You show up to your own son's birthday with a piece of wood you glued together in the garage? That's all you've got?
This is what a successful man brings a child. Not some embarrassing little craft project from a man who's never accomplished a single thing in his life.
You've been useless for years. At least make yourself entertaining for once.
My father used to say that money can buy attention, but only adversity shows you who a person really is. I didn't fully understand what he meant when I was young. I thought it was just something men said when they wanted to sound wise. But Warren Pierce wasn't the kind of man who spoke to fill silence. Every word he chose had weight behind it, and by the time I was standing outside my own house with cake drying on my face and my son's voice breaking through the window behind me, I understood exactly what he meant, and I understood that he had been trying to protect me from this moment for my entire life. My name is Nolan Pierce. I'm 38 years old. I grew up in a household that had money, real money, but you would never have known it from the way my father lived. Warren built his investment firm from nothing, starting with a single-room office and a phone he shared with 2 other people. He drove the same car for 12 years. He wore the same watch my grandfather had given him. He made it clear to me from the time I was old enough to follow a conversation that the worst thing a man could do was let his wealth become his personality. He believed that the moment people knew what you were worth, they stopped seeing who you were. They started seeing what they could get, what they could justify, what they felt entitled to. And once that started, you could never fully trust what you were being shown. He died when I was 29. He left me the firm, a letter I still keep in my desk drawer, and a single piece of advice that I have turned over in my mind more times than I can count. Don't let anyone love you for the wrong reasons, because one day the wrong reasons will run out and you'll have nothing left. At the time, I thought it was the kind of thing a father says because he has to say something meaningful on his way out. Later, I understood it was the most important thing he ever told me, and that I had not fully believed it until it was almost too late. I took the firm and built it into something my father couldn't have imagined. Pierce Meridian Group now operates across real estate, transportation, and financial technology. My personal net worth crossed $6 billion 3 years ago, but I don't appear in financial publications. I don't give interviews or attend industry events where photographs are taken. Every major deal is handled through our board, our legal team, and a network of subsidiaries that keep my name several layers removed from any public record. To most people, I simply don't exist as a figure of wealth or influence. That was entirely intentional, and for a long time I believed it was the smartest decision I had ever made. I kept it that way for 2 reasons. I had a son, and I didn't want Jalen growing up in an environment where everything was handed to him before he understood what things actually cost in effort and time. I wanted him to know what it felt like to work towards something to earn the right to be proud of what he built. And I had a wife, or I believed I had one, and I needed to know that what she felt for me was real, not shaped by accounts or assets or the doors my name could open. When Alicia and I got married, I told her I was an independent investment consultant. It was true enough. I worked from home most days, took calls at odd hours, and maintained what looked like a modest but comfortable income. We lived in a good house, not extravagant, not shabby. I drove a car that was several years old. I transferred the majority of my assets into the Pierce Family Trust, which meant nothing in our household reflected what I actually controlled. I thought this arrangement was wisdom. I would come to understand it was also a gamble. The early years of our marriage were genuinely good. Alicia was warm and direct and grounded in a way I admired and trusted. She loved that I was present with Jalen, that I coached his weekend soccer, that I cooked Sunday dinners, that I didn't disappear into work the way so many fathers did. We weren't perfect together, but we were solid, and I believed we had built something worth protecting. I held on to that belief longer than I probably should have, because I didn't want to see what was changing right in front of me. The shift started when Alicia got promoted at Bennett Crest Holdings. Bennett Crest was a mid-size real estate development company that looked healthy on the surface and had been quietly bleeding money for 2 years through bad acquisitions and over-leveraged projects. Pierce Meridian had been tracking them for months, and our board had opened preliminary discussions about a buyout structured to preserve several thousand jobs. I couldn't tell Alicia any of this. The deal was under strict confidentiality agreement, and my involvement was not public. I was watching the company from the inside of a different room, waiting for the right moment, while Alicia was watching it from the inside of a different one entirely. What I didn't anticipate was Terrence Boyd. He was a business director at Bennett Crest tailored suits, imported shoes, a rotating selection of luxury vehicles, and a mouth that never stopped moving about the rooms he had access to and the people he knew. It was performance, all of it. I could see the scaffolding from where I stood, but Alicia was surrounded by it every day, and performance, if it's consistent enough, starts to look like substance. He began appearing in her stories first, then in her conversations, and then in the way she looked at me when she came home, like she was measuring me against something I didn't know I was being compared to. The comparisons became a regular feature of our evenings. The car I drove versus the cars Terrence drove. The vacations we hadn't taken versus the trips he described at work. The title I didn't have versus the one printed on his business card. Every week there was something new, and the language was always slightly off from how Alicia normally spoke, more curated, more pointed. Terrence's framing had gotten inside her thinking without her realizing it, and she was delivering his conclusions as though they were her own. Her mother, Denise, only deepened the problem. Denise Carter had never fully accepted me from the beginning. She was a woman who measured worth by what was visible, and she had communicated since the early days of our marriage that she believed Alicia had settled. When Terrence appeared, Denise didn't investigate or question. She simply recognized the version of events that confirmed everything she had always wanted to believe, and she committed to it completely. She started appearing at our house more often. She inserted herself into conversations that didn't involve her, and when Alicia and I disagreed about anything, Denise was somehow always nearby, always ready with a look that said more than she needed to put into words. I kept my patience because of Jalen. I didn't want my son to grow up watching his parents tear each other apart across the dinner table. But there were nights when I sat alone after he was asleep and asked myself honestly whether I was protecting him or just avoiding the inevitable while the damage accumulated around us. Meanwhile, Bennett Crest was moving closer to collapse, and the acquisition timeline was tightening. I said nothing to Alicia, because using that information to force her respect was something I refused to do. If she came back to me because I threatened her financial security, I would never know whether she had ever genuinely seen me at all. I wanted to be chosen, not feared. 1 week before Jalen's 8th birthday, I discovered what Alicia had been quietly arranging. She had withdrawn a significant amount from our joint account and used it to organize a party at our house, rental furniture, catered food, a DJ, decoration throughout the backyard. She hadn't mentioned any of it to me. I found the receipts by accident while going through paperwork. Terrence Boyd's name was on the guest list. I didn't confront her. I went to the garage and finished what I had been building for weeks, a wooden airplane sized for a child's hands, detailed enough to show the ribs under the wing paneling. Jalen and I had drawn the blueprint together on a Saturday afternoon 2 years earlier when he had decided he wanted to be a pilot, and I had told him that was an excellent plan. Inside the box beneath the plane, I placed a handwritten card with a single promise: "When you're old enough, we'll build a real one together." From scratch. The night before the party, I was passing through the hallway when I heard voices from the kitchen. The door was partly open. Alicia and Denise were speaking in the low, deliberate tone of people finishing a plan rather than starting one. Denise was telling Alicia to humiliate me in front of the guests to make me look small, to give me enough reason to walk away without a legal fight. Alicia said she had the divorce papers ready. She planned to hand them to me at the party. Terrence had promised to help her keep the house. I stood in that hallway and listened to the end, not because I was paralyzed, but because I was calculating. If I walked in and stopped it right there, there would be no witnesses to anything. Alicia could tell whatever version she needed to tell. But she had already invited 40 people into my home, 40 people who would see exactly what happened, whose accounts would carry weight in any legal proceeding that followed. I made a decision in that hallway I would not stop the party. I would let every person she had chosen as her audience become a witness to what she was willing to do. I went to bed knowing what was coming. By the time morning arrived, I had made my peace with it. By 2 in the afternoon, the backyard was full. 40 people, maybe a few more colleagues from Bennett Crest, neighbors I recognized by face, a handful of Alicia's friends from before we were married. They moved through the space easily because Alicia had arranged everything to communicate a version of our life that didn't match the one we actually lived. The rented furniture, the catered trays, the string lights overhead, all of it designed to perform a kind of prosperity we didn't have and a happiness we no longer shared. Denise had positioned herself near the kitchen entrance, greeting guests as they arrived, accepting compliments about the setup as though she had organized it personally. She wore a dress I had never seen before and moved through the yard with the particular ease of a woman who believed she was finally in the room she deserved. I carried a tray of food past her at one point. She didn't acknowledge me. When I set the tray down near the drink station, a man I didn't recognize asked what I did for work. Before I could answer, Denise materialized at my elbow and smiled at the man. "He invests," she said pleasantly, "in dreams that don't quite pay out." The man offered a polite chuckle and moved on. I refilled the tray and went back inside without responding because I had already decided that nothing Denise said that afternoon would pull me off the course I had set for myself. I had been assigned, without discussion, to the role of household staff at my own son's birthday party. I carried things, I cleared plates, and I stayed out of the photographs. At one point, Alicia called me over and asked me to move a table 6 inches to the left because it was blocking the shot she wanted. I moved it. She turned back to her conversation without a word. I understood that this was exactly what she wanted, to make me invisible in my own house, in front of her own witnesses, so that when she handed me those papers later, it would look like a natural conclusion rather than a decision she had been building toward for months. Terrence arrived late, which I suspected was deliberate. He wanted to be seen arriving. He came through the backyard gate in a light gray suit, no tie, the kind of effortful casualness that takes real money to perform. People responded the way people respond to someone who has already decided they're important. They made space, they smiled, they asked questions. He found Alicia within 30 seconds. She touched his arm when he said something I couldn't hear from where I was standing. Then she turned to the group around them and said loudly enough to carry across the yard, "Terrence has been such a support to our family this year. Honestly, I don't know where we'd be without him." I was standing 12 feet away. Nobody looked at me. Throughout the first hour, Terrence moved through the party, delivering the same story to different clusters of guests that he was about to be named Vice President of Business Development following the acquisition of Bennett Crest Holdings, that the acquiring group had already communicated his value to the new ownership structure, that his role in facilitating the transition had been recognized at the highest level. Every word was invented. The acquiring group he was describing was my company. The ownership structure he was celebrating was mine, and the recognition he was anticipating would look nothing like what he was imagining. Jalen knew something was wrong. He's 8, but he's perceptive in the particular way children become perceptive when they've grown up in a house with tension underneath the surface, always reading the room, always calibrating. He came and found me twice in the first hour, both times slipping his hand into mine without saying anything. The second time, he looked up at me and asked quietly whether I was okay. I told him I was fine. I asked him if he was having a good birthday. He said kind of. I said that was fair and honest, and I appreciated it. Both times, Alicia called him back within minutes. She wanted him in photographs, wanted him positioned next to Terrence, smiling into someone's phone. Jalen did it because his mother asked him to, but he kept looking back over his shoulder at me, checking, making sure I was still there. The gift opening started just after 3 o'clock. Alicia had organized it with the same instinct for visibility that had shaped everything else that afternoon. Guests gathered in a circle in the center of the yard. Jalen at the center, multiple people ready with phones. The gifts were arranged in matching paper from smallest to largest, and the whole setup had the choreographed feel of something meant to be shared online rather than experienced in person. I was standing at the edge of the circle with the wooden airplane in my hands when Jalen saw it. He recognized it before I reached him, not because it was visually impressive, but because he had been there when we drew the blueprints. He knew what it was and what it had taken to make. He reached out and took it with both hands and held it the way you hold something you already understand matters. Alicia stepped forward and pulled it out of his grip in a single motion. Then she held it out in front of her, looked at it with open contempt, and dropped it on the grass. "Are you serious right now?" Her voice was steady and deliberate and loud enough for everyone in the circle to hear without straining. "You show up to your own son's birthday with a piece of wood you glued together in the garage. That's all you've got?" Jalen stood very still and looked at the airplane on the ground. The circle had gone quiet. Denise moved behind me while I was still processing what had happened. She grabbed both my shoulders with both hands and held me in place from behind. Her grip was harder than I expected. This was not a spontaneous gesture. Terrence reached into his jacket and produced a small box. He opened it and extended it toward Jalen. Inside was a watch, a branded, expensive one, the kind designed for a grown man. He spoke calmly, the way people speak when they want to sound reasonable while saying something cruel. "This is what a successful man brings a child, not some embarrassing little craft project from a man who has never accomplished a single thing in his life." Several people in the circle laughed. Not the whole room, but enough. Jalen did not take the watch. He stepped around Terrence, crouched down on the grass, and picked up the airplane himself. He held it against his chest. Then he turned to his mother and said in a voice steadier than it had any right to be, "Why did you do that to Dad's gift?" The yard went still. Something about the directness of it, the clarity of a child asking a question that all the adults around him had stopped being willing to ask, cut through everything else in the space. Alicia's expression shifted from contempt to irritation. "Jalen put that down and thanked Terrence." Jalen shook his head and held the plane tighter. I stepped forward and kept my voice low and even. "Alicia, don't do this to him on his birthday." She looked at me for a moment, and I could see in her face that my staying calm was being read as weakness, that my refusal to match her volume was confirming the story she had been telling herself about me for the past year. She looked over at Terrence, then she looked back at me. "You've been useless for years," she said, quietly, almost gently. "At least make yourself entertaining for once." Denise's hands tightened on my shoulders. Alicia placed her palm flat on the back of my head, and I understood what was coming before it happened. I made a deliberate choice not to resist, not out of defeat, but because pulling away physically in front of 40 people and in front of my son would change the story from what Alicia did to what I did in response. She drove my face down into the birthday cake. The frosting covered my eyes and nose and mouth. There was a half-second of complete silence before Denise burst out laughing, not a small surprised laugh, but a loud, full laugh she wanted everyone to hear. Terrence joined her. The sound spread through parts of the crowd in the unsteady way that group laughter spreads when people aren't entirely sure they should be participating, but follow the lead of whoever seems most confident. Alicia held my head down for several seconds longer than necessary, long enough to make the point she was trying to make. When she finally let go, I straightened up slowly. I didn't wipe my face right away. I didn't raise my voice or lunge forward or do anything that would give anyone present a reason to remember this moment as the one where I lost control. I stood up straight and let the moment be exactly what it was in front of every witness she had invited. Then Jalen was beside me. He was crying hard and using the sleeve of his shirt to wipe the frosting from my eyes. His hands were shaking. He kept saying, "Why did she do that? Why did she do that to my dad?" And the rawness of it, A child wiping his father's face clean in front of 40 adults who had chosen to stand still made the yard go silent in a different way than before. I crouched down and wiped his face first, then mine. I told him he didn't owe anyone an apology for something that wasn't his fault. I told him to keep holding the airplane. He nodded and gripped it tighter against his chest. Alicia pulled an envelope from somewhere nearby and walked to the table where the ruined cake still sat. She placed the papers on top of the frosting and looked at me steadily. "This marriage is over," she said. "Sign it tonight and get out of this house." I looked at the papers for a moment, then I looked at her. "Is this what you want?" I asked, not as a plea, as a final confirmation in front of witnesses that she was making this choice clearly and with full awareness. She didn't answer with words. She pushed the envelope across the table toward me. She picked up the pen first and signed her name in the designated line. Then she held the pen out to me. I took it and signed beneath hers. Then Denise stepped forward, produced a second pen from her purse. She had brought her own, which told me everything about how long this moment had been planned, and signed the witness line with visible satisfaction. "Finally," she said, "my daughter is finally free." She looked around the circle of guests as she said it, making sure everyone heard. In the days before the party, Camille had forwarded me documentation that our audit team had surfaced during acquisition due diligence. The findings were significant. Terrence had been systematically misappropriating Bennett Crest funds for over a year, falsifying revenue entries, routing money through vendor accounts he personally controlled, and charging personal expenses, including gifts for Alicia, to a corporate card. The total was well into 6 figures. Beyond that, the audit log showed that several of those transactions had been processed through Alicia's system credentials and that entries had been deleted by someone operating under her access level. The legal team couldn't establish yet whether she had understood the full scope of what she was enabling, but her access was documented, her approvals were time-stamped, and there was one more detail that neither Alicia nor Denise had accounted for in any of their planning. The house had never been a marital asset. It was held entirely within the Pierce family trust, and Alicia's right to occupy it was contingent on the marriage remaining legally intact. She had just signed papers terminating the marriage. I needed to let the legal sequence complete before revealing any of this. Camille had explained it clearly. If I disclosed my identity in that moment, immediately after being handed divorce papers in front of 40 witnesses, Alicia's legal team could argue that I used financial leverage to coerce a wife who simply wanted to leave. The papers needed to be signed, the decision needed to be hers, and the process needed to run its natural course. I understood all of that. But it wasn't the legal reasoning that kept me from saying anything. It was Jalen. He had already seen too much. I was not going to turn what remained of his birthday into something louder and more chaotic than it had already become. After the papers were signed, Alicia turned to 2 men standing near the yard entrance, private security she had arranged and positioned before the party started, which confirmed for me exactly how long this plan had been in motion. She told them quietly to escort me from the property. I didn't argue. I went inside, retrieved the single bag I had packed that morning, came back through the yard, past guests who had stopped being able to hold eye contact with me, and picked up the broken wing piece that Denise had snapped off the airplane when she stepped on it. The security walked me toward the front door. Jalen reached me before I got there. He ran and locked his arms around my legs and wouldn't let go. He said he didn't want the watch. He didn't want any of it. He just wanted to keep the airplane and he wanted me to stay. I crouched down on the front step with frosting still in my hair and held my son's face in both hands. "I am not leaving you," I said. "I am leaving a place where the adults forgot how to treat each other. That is not the same thing." He looked at me with the effort of someone trying very hard to believe what they're being told. Denise came to the door and pulled him back by the arm. Alicia stood behind her and watched. She didn't move to stop it. The door closed. I stood on the sidewalk with one bag, a broken piece of wood, and dried frosting on my collar. Through the front window, I could see Terrence standing in the living room with the ease of someone who believed he had just taken something that belonged to him. Next to him, Alicia had her back to the glass, but Jalen had climbed up on the couch. He had both hands pressed flat against the window, and he was watching me and crying. I raised my hand. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A message from our board chair, a single line confirming that Pierce Meridian Group had officially completed the acquisition of Bennett Crest Holdings, effective immediately. On Monday morning, I would walk into that building as its new owner. Standing on that sidewalk, I didn't feel like a man who had just closed a significant deal. I felt like a father who had been pushed out of his own house while his son watched from the inside. The money had never felt more distant from anything that actually mattered. But I also knew, with the same clarity I brought to every acquisition, exactly what came next. I spent Sunday night in a hotel room 11 blocks from my house. I ordered coffee I didn't drink and sat at the desk by the window going through the acquisition documents one final time. Everything was in order. The board had confirmed, the legal transfer was complete. By 8 o'clock Monday morning, Bennett Crest Holdings would open its doors under new ownership, and its employees would gather in the main conference hall to meet the person who now controlled their futures. I called Camille just before midnight. "You ready?" she asked. "I've been ready for a while," I said. She asked how Jalen was doing. I had spoken to him briefly that afternoon through a neighbor who had slipped away from the party early and offered to help without being asked. Jalen had told me he put the wooden airplane on his nightstand and that he wasn't going to let anyone near it. I told Camille he was going to be okay eventually. She asked how I was. I said to ask me tomorrow. The Bennett Crest lobby was full by 8:15. The company had sent a building-wide notice the previous Friday, mandatory all-staff meeting Monday morning, new ownership announcement. Everyone was required to attend. I had written the notice. I arrived through a side entrance with Camille and 3 members of our legal team and waited in a corridor behind the conference hall while the room filled. Through the wall, I could hear the particular sound of several hundred people who don't know what's coming but have agreed to be professionally optimistic about it. Then I heard Terrence's voice carrying above the rest. He was telling someone nearby that he expected to be named incoming Vice President of Business Development. He said the acquiring group had reached out to him personally. He said his role in facilitating the transition had been recognized at the highest level. Every word was a fabrication he had assembled from confidence and nothing else. At 8:30, the board chair opened the meeting and asked the staff to welcome the new owner. I walked through the door. The room registered me in stages, first the people near the front who could see my face, then the screens on either side of the stage lit up with the Pierce Meridian Group logo, my name as founding principal beneath it, and the transaction summary. The room went quiet in the specific way that large rooms go quiet when something has happened that people need a moment to fully process. I took the podium without hurrying and looked out at the audience. Terrence was in the 3rd row. I watched his face as he read the screen. I watched the exact moment he made the connection, the company name, my face, the man whose face had been pushed into a birthday cake 48 hours earlier in front of 40 witnesses he had helped select. The realization didn't make him collapse. It was subtler. A controlled rearrangement behind his eyes, a restructuring of everything he thought he understood about the situation he was in. Alicia was seated toward the middle of the room. She had come in that morning expecting a promotion and a future and had dressed accordingly. When the slide displaying my role as founding principal appeared on screen, she looked at it without moving for a long time. I could see her working through it, the house, the trust, the acquisition, the papers she had signed 2 days ago, and watching each piece land in a different order than she had been expecting. Denise was near the back of the room. She had come as moral support, apparently. She looked at the screen, then at me, then back at the screen, as though she was waiting for someone to appear and explain that a name had been entered incorrectly somewhere. I introduced myself to the staff the way I would introduce myself to any room of people whose livelihoods I had taken responsibility for directly, without theater. I told them the acquisition had been driven by the quality of the company's workforce and the strength of its underlying assets, not its current leadership structure. I told them our intention was stability, not disruption, and that everyone whose position was in good standing would receive written confirmation within the week. Then I nodded to Camille and she connected her laptop to the room's display system. What appeared on screen was precise and thorough. 14 months of falsified vendor transactions, shell accounts routed through a network Terrence personally controlled, a corporate card used for private purchases totaling well over $200,000, including items that could be traced directly to Alicia. Then the access logs, timestamps showing which credentials had approved the transactions and which credentials had been used to delete the original entries from the audit trail. Alicia's employee ID appeared 4 separate times. People in the room began turning in their seats to look at her. Terrence stood before anyone addressed him. He had a strategy ready, and he delivered it smoothly. He said the transactions had been processed on his instruction and that Alicia had cooperated because he told her it was standard interdepartmental accounting. He said she hadn't understood what she was approving. He said it like a man who had rehearsed it. Alicia turned and looked at him. I've thought about that moment many times since. In the space of a few seconds, she had to absorb not just that he was cutting her loose, but that he had been prepared to cut her loose since the beginning, that the man she had chosen over her marriage had a contingency plan that involved placing her directly in front of whatever was coming. She had traded a husband who had never once used his position against her for someone who had just made her the exit strategy in a room full of her colleagues. She didn't say anything. She just looked at him, and the look said everything that needed to be said. Camille then presented the property documentation. She explained, without any unnecessary drama, that the residence listed in Alicia's personnel file was held within the Pierce family trust. She explained that Alicia's right to occupy the property had been tied to the continuity of the marriage. She noted the date of the divorce filing. She noted the signatures on the papers and their witnesses. She said the property would not be subject to marital asset division because it had never been a marital asset. From the back of the room, Denise said that wasn't possible, that the house was in her daughter's name. Camille said the occupancy agreement was in her name. The property title was not. Denise looked around the room, waiting for someone to contradict this. Nobody did. She sat down slowly, and I watched her understand piece by piece what she had actually done, that she had spent months engineering her daughter's exit from a marriage to a man she believed was a failure, that she had held him in place while her daughter drove his face into a birthday cake, that she had signed the divorce papers with visible pleasure, and that the house she had encouraged Alicia to borrow against had never been Alicia's to borrow against. She had not rescued her daughter. She had helped her walk off a ledge she didn't know was there. Alicia asked to speak with me privately. She said it quietly, not to the room, just toward me. I told her this wasn't the place for that conversation. She said my name. I said that all of it would be handled through the appropriate legal process, and that was the only thing I had to say in that setting. I meant it. I was not going to perform my anger in front of her colleagues. What had happened between us was real, and the damage was real, and it would take time and lawyers and a judge to sort through properly. But the way I conducted myself from that point forward would matter to Jalen in ways I couldn't fully predict, and I was not going to give him a version of his father that he'd have to make excuses for later. I said to the room what I needed to say. Legal processes would be followed for everyone involved. No one would be punished simply for having offended me personally, and no one would be exempted from accountability because of a personal connection to me. Those were the terms. Terrence was suspended before he left the building that morning and formally charged 3 weeks later, wire fraud, embezzlement, falsification of corporate records. When investigators placed him under oath, he acknowledged that his relationship with Alicia had been transactional from the beginning. He had identified her system access early in their acquaintance and cultivated the relationship specifically because of what she could provide him operationally. He had never intended anything beyond that. Alicia lost her position at Bennett Crest. Her level of knowing participation remained genuinely ambiguous, and because she cooperated fully with investigators and provided documentation that strengthened the case against Terrence, the legal consequences for her were significantly lighter. She was not charged, but she lost her professional standing, her claim to the house, and every version of the future she had been building in her mind for the better part of a year. The family court process moved quickly, given the available evidence. 3 guests had recorded parts of the birthday party on their phones. Multiple people provided written statements. The judge reviewed the footage, the statements, and the documented pattern of Alicia positioning Terrence as a replacement father figure in Jalen's life. Primary custody was awarded to me. Alicia received scheduled visitation, with standing conditions that Denise not be present during those visits and that no negative statements about me be made in Jalen's presence. I didn't try to remove Jalen from his mother. That was never the goal. What I wanted was an environment where the people around my son were required to meet a minimum standard of conduct. That was the only thing I asked the court to enforce. I set up a home for us in a quieter neighborhood. Jalen chose his own room. He asked if we could frame the original blueprint, the hand-drawn one from when he was 6, and hang it above his desk. I had it framed the following weekend. We fixed the airplane together on a Saturday afternoon in the new kitchen. We didn't replace the broken wing with a new one. We glued it back along the fracture line and sanded it level, but if you held it up in the right light, you could still see the repair. Jalen studied it for a moment and said it was actually better that way, that you could tell it had been through something. I told him I thought that was exactly right. On the morning of Jalen's 9th birthday, I drove him to a small private airfield outside the city. It was part of an aviation education facility that Pierce Meridian had been funding quietly for 2 years, a program designed to give young people from underserved communities access to flight training and aerospace education. Jalen didn't know any of that context. He just knew we were going somewhere for his birthday and that I had told him to wear comfortable shoes. Inside the main hangar, pushed to the center of the floor, was a single-engine aircraft painted in the exact color scheme from our old blueprint cream body blue stripe along the tail, the same proportions we had sketched on the living room floor when he was 6. On the instrument panel, I had placed the repaired wooden airplane, the cracked wing facing forward. Jalen stood in front of the real plane for a long time without saying anything. Then he turned around with the expression of someone trying very hard not to cry about something that deserves to be cried about. "You remembered," he said. "I wrote it down," I said. "I keep my promises." Alicia was there at a distance. She had asked if she could come, and after thinking it over for several days, I said yes. She stood near the hangar entrance in plain clothes, no jewelry, nothing that announced her. When Jalen saw her, he was quiet for a moment. Then he walked over. She crouched down and told him she was sorry for the airplane, for the party, for the choices she had made that had hurt him. She said she had confused what things cost with what they were worth, and that it had taken losing everything she thought she had to understand the difference. Jalen listened to all of it. Then he said okay, not as full forgiveness, but as an acknowledgement that the conversation had happened and that he was willing to let it exist. He asked if she wanted to see the plane. She said yes. The 3 of us stood in that hangar together, looking at something that had started as a sketch on a Saturday afternoon and survived everything that came after it. Later, driving home, Jalen asked me why I hadn't told people about the money sooner. I thought about it for a moment before answering. I told him I had believed that hiding it was how you found out what people truly felt. I told him I thought if no one knew, I'd be able to see things more clearly. He asked if it worked. I said it showed me the truth, but I said I probably could have seen the truth earlier if I had trusted what I was already seeing instead of waiting for a test to confirm it. He nodded, slowly storing it away. Before we got home, he reached into the back seat and picked up the wooden airplane. He held it in his lap for the rest of the drive. At one point, he ran his thumb along the repaired wing slowly, the way you touch something you're making sure is still there. The crack was still visible. It would always be visible. But the wing held. What stays with me from all of it isn't the moment the room found out who I was. It's Jalen, 8 years old, wiping frosting off his father's face, while 40 adults stood and watched. Children don't measure you by your net worth or your job title. They measure you by whether you showed up, whether you kept your word, and whether you stayed calm when everything around you wasn't. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a good time. There's more where this came from, and I think you'll want to be here for it.